All right, Gael, very nice to meet you. Thanks for jumping on for this discussion. I think we wanted to both get on to discuss the previous election results that just came out this Sunday. I discovered you just a couple of weeks ago in your Substack on Colombian politics. And since I've really been focusing on Colombian politics and elections over the first half of this year with the legislative elections and the presidential elections, I wanted to have you on and basically us kind of talk through the results and what you think. Can maybe go ahead and introduce yourself and the work that you've been doing on Substack over the past couple of years.
Of course. Well, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for taking the time tonight to discuss this. My name is Gael. I'm the editor of the Colombian Politics and Elections Substack. I've been running it since 2022, so covering the past 4 years of this administration in Colombian politics. And this election, it's a small Substack still, and I am focused especially on election and voting patterns and uh, Colombian politics with a more historical perspective, looking back at the past and looking a bit towards the future as well. So it's I'm looking forward to discuss this very interesting election.
It was a fascinating election. Really, I felt really lucky when I found your work because I'm a Colombian citizen and but I grew up in the United States, and while I can speak Spanish, really my first language is English. And so when I found your English level work, your English le language work, it really goes in deep, it's really profound, and I think it really helps to um translate to English language audiences, Colombian politics. So, really, thanks for hopping on. A little introduction for myself. I'm Sergio Uribe Henao. I am a Colombian American, and my own Substack, Atlas Electoral, is something I've been working on now for around a little more than half a year, maybe 8 to 9 months. And really, my focus is electoral processes from around the world, looking at the different political cultures, the electoral systems, the geographies as well. Um, and I provide some maps. You also love to provide some visuals, and I think it's a great complement. They complement each other very well. So um, I think we can go ahead and just start on the overall election results. So. I was quite surprised on Sunday night when we saw the election results come in, and I wonder if you were also surprised with the result as well. To remind viewers, people watching at home, Abelardo de la Espriella had come into had left the first round in a surprising first place finish. And a lot of the polls were showing him around 5 to 7 to 8 points, some even 10 percentage points above Ivan Cepeda, the left-wing candidate. And on election night, what we saw was a race that was decided by less than 1 percentage point. What are your thoughts on what we saw?
So it was, in fact, the closest election in terms of percentage margin in Colombian history decided by less than 1%.
Hmm.
It's the first time that a Colombian presidential election in modern history has been decided by less than 1%. There's been, in terms of actual votes, smaller margins in the past, but with smaller electorates in terms of percentage margin, this was the closest one. The previous closest one was elections like in 1994, which I think was around 2 points, and the contested 1970 elections, I think, was around a bit over 1 percentage point. So this
Hmm.
is the closest. Um, I was not entirely surprised
Okay.
about the closeness of this margin.
Hmm.
I think that the political divide, the political polarization between left and right in Colombia has remained very tight over the past 4 years. There's not been much change in the margins. It still remained a quite 50-50 divide in terms of the voting public between left and right.
Hmm.
Um, in the first round, the votes for the right and the left were quite similar to what they were in 2022. Um,
With the
They're
right having an advantage there.
with the right having an advantage though, as they had in 2022
Right.
in the first round. The circumstances are different in the runoff, so it was decided by turnout and it was decided by differentials in one candidate's ability to mobilize and capitalize on their side's potential electorate. The right was better this year at maximizing and capitalizing on their first round vote
Hmm.
and carrying that over to the second round. But the left also had success this year in mobilizing particularly new voters as they had in 2022. This year it wasn't quite enough, but it was enough to make it extremely close.
And it was a record-breaking turnout as well, 63%. I think, Colombians love to talk instead of what I've gathered is that the media, the Colombian media, instead of talking about percentages, they talk about raw numbers when a candidate needs to get 12 to 13 million in order to win, or they're expecting 23 to 25 million voters. And they actually ended up getting around 26 million voters turn out to vote in a country of around 55 million, if I'm not mistaken.
So the turnout was 63, which is the highest turnout on record in first or second round. There's it the highest on record since that I can find in modern Colombian history post 1930.
Hmm.
Uh, Colombia has historically been a country of low turnout compared to other countries in Latin America and in the Americas. It's been a country where some elections have had as low as 35 or 40% voter turnout in the first round, like in 2014. And there's been a gradual increase in turnout since 2014 or 2018. Turnout in 2022 was already very high, already quasi record breaking.
Hmm.
Turnout in the first round this year was basically same level as it was in the runoff in 2022, and this year's runoff was even higher than the first round, from 58 to 63% turnout, which is again record breaking. So I think the polarization of the country
Right.
between left and right has really been drawn out and mobilized voters and engaged a lot of voters on both the left and the right. Both the left has driven out a lot of voters that previously didn't vote at all in presidential elections, especially, and the right has also had success in mobilizing right-wing voters. There's been very strong passions on both sides, on the left and the right, about this election.
And I guess you can have that discussion on whether that's good for democracy. The assumption always is the higher participation, the healthier the democracy. But when you have this record-breaking turnout with really vitriol on both sides, uh, as we've seen in the last 4 years, and as you've covered extensively in Colombia, this causes a strain on the institutions, and that's something that we can talk about it as well after we dive into the maps. But the stress on the electoral institutions that we've seen over the past couple of months as well. Do you want to talk about anything on that, or should we jump into the visuals maybe and look at how this polarization looks like?
I guess we can jump into the visuals and look at what the maps look like and see the polarization over the years, since I don't think the polarization is anything new.
The first visual that we're kind of gonna jump into is something that I've put together, and I have it in my newest piece on the election results. And basically, what I do for this, uh, I take the country, and although this shows it on the departmental level, I kind of divide the different departments up. And Colombia has 34 departments, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
There's 32 departments
30.
and Bogota, so 33.
33 departments, and I kind of divide them into different regions. And the different regions are, geographic, they're also sociocultural. And so I kind of look at the raw vote count. And as I said previously, Colombians really like to talk about the campaigns, the media, they really like to talk about what does Cepeda have to get out of a certain region? How many votes does Abelardo de las Priella feel like he needs to get out of his strongholds? And so I divide these regions up, and each region has a sway, right? So as we know, since 2014 and even farther back in the 1990s, the the liberals or the more progressive candidate wins the election by capturing Bogota in the coasts. You have this kind of, I call it the progressive periphery. So you have the the Pacific coast, the Caribbean coast, and Bogota, and that really allows a more progressive candidate to win. You saw that in 2014 with Santos in his reelection, and you also saw that in 2022 and almost in 2026 as we see here. So basically, the what I wanted to point out was how you had Cepeda get the same amount of net margins out of the Pacific, around 1.5 million. So he really kept that there, and really there you see a lot of the Afro-Colombian population as a big pillar for the progressives. Then you go to the Caribbean, and he lost around 150,000 in the net vote margins out of the Caribbean coast. And this is something that we both saw and covered with the fact that Abelardo de la Espriella is from the Caribbean coast. He grew up in Monteria in the department of Córdoba. And so there was a question of how well he was going to perform in the Caribbean coast. And I was frankly a bit surprised that we didn't see more departments flip, perhaps like department like Cesar. I was under the impression it was going to flip because in the first round, if you combined the votes, which you can't really combine the votes, but if you combine Abelardo de las Priella's votes with Paloma Valencia's, it would have put them over on top of Cepeda. But as you spoke to previously, um, uh, there was a boost in turnout as well in the second round, so I think that had a play as well. Now I won't go through it all, and I'll leave it up for discussion. One of the points that I did find interesting was um, in the Amazons. This was a region where there's not a lot of population. It's very sparsely populated, but Cepeda was able to double the net margin that Gustavo Petro got in 2022. So that was something that I found quite interesting, although obviously not enough to flip the election.
Yeah, so I like this map because I think it's always useful to talk in terms of regions. In terms of regions, the big problem for Cepeda was in Bogota. Bogota was one of the three key regions for Petro in 2022, and he won by 700,000 votes or so in 2022.
Hmm.
This year, the left lost votes in Bogota, both raw votes and percentage share.
Right.
Um, and Cepeda did win in Bogota in the runoff, but only by 300,000 votes, by a much smaller margin than 4 years ago. And there's many things that decided this election. We can point to many departments where the margin is bigger than the national margin, but Bogota was the problem for the left. Um, the Caribbean was survivable. The
Hmm.
loss in the Caribbean was survivable, but Bogota was not.
Right.
So the left did claw back a bit of ground in Bogota in the second round, but
Hmm.
was not enough. And really, that's a very big shrinking down the margin for the left in Bogota. And Bogota has always been critical for the left in 2022 and for centrist aligned candidates like Santos in 2014 as well.
Absolutely. No, and from some of the reporting I had heard a lot of the loss of the middle class voter from that Petro had won 4 years ago and that Cepeda was unable to really capture to the biggest extent was the biggest downfall in Bogota.
I think that was the big factor in Bogota, especially, but also in other major cities. Colombian politics in major cities and major urban areas are really divided along class lines.
Hmm.
Um, Colombia often talks in terms of estatus socioeconómicos or like socioeconomic strata. This is not a good correlation for income because it measures the physical characteristics of a house
Hmm.
for public utility purposes, but is kind of a good cover for class and income. And basically, the lower it goes from 1 to 6, with 1 and 2 being the lowest, and 5 and 6 being the highest. But the main elections are played around the stratus 2, 3, and 4, 2 being lower middle class or lower class, 3 being this middle class to lower middle class area, and 4 being a kind of middle to upper middle class area. And I think in terms of share, the stratus 2, 3, and 4 are the biggest in any city, especially in Bogota. And this is where Cepeda did lose a lot of votes in Bogota, in a lot of these like middle class, lower middle class
Hmm.
areas in Bogota, in localities like Fontibon, Engativá, parts of Kennedy, where Petro had done quite well in 2022, but Cepeda really lost ground, and Abelardo was able to capture a lot of middle class urban votes in Bogota, but also in cities like in Cali, which is quite left wing. And at the same time, Abelardo was able to maintain the right's traditional stranglehold on the very wealthy electorate that you find in places like Usaquén or Chapinero in Bogota.
Absolutely. No, and you know, one of the things that I found insightful in one of your pieces was the fact that the urban rural divide that we see in Western democracies all over the world really hasn't shown up to the same extent in Colombia. In Colombia, you have left-wing cities and you have right-wing cities. And that's something that I think in the next maps we're really going to be able to look better at.
Yes, so there's no urban-rural divide that we can speak of. We have cities like Bogota, which are left-leaning, cities like Cali as well, which are left-leaning, but
Mhm.
you also have very right-wing cities like Medellin in Antioquia or Cúcuta in Norte de Santander, or you have Bucaramanga in Santander, or even smaller cities like Manizales, Ibagué, Neiva
Right.
that are quite right-wing, with left-wing cities as well like Barranquilla, which is quite close, Cartagena, which is left-leaning, cities like Ipiales and Pasto in Nariño that are left-leaning. So
Mhm.
we can't really speak of an urban-rural divide. We do see on the map a kind of divide, as you say, between the core and the periphery. It's not perfect because Bogota is quite clearly the core of the country, but votes
Mhm.
along with the periphery, the Pacific and the Caribbean and the Amazon. So we see the Andean regions and part of the Eastern Plains voting traditionally for the right over the past 10 years, and the Pacific, Caribbean, and Amazon, so kind of the coastal regions, the periphery, voting for the left. So I think it's more of a core versus periphery divide on
Mhm.
the maps than any kind of urban versus rural divide.
Well, on that point, let's perhaps move on to some of the maps that you put together for us, because I think that shows us really well. And I think this goes back to Colombia's evolution as a centralized state with, you know, if you've ever been to Colombia, the Andes Mountains that go all the way up the western coast of South America. Colombia is a country that gets divided. This mountain range gets divided into three different mountain ranges. So the country's full of uh, huge mountain ranges and then big valleys. And it really made it in the past, and even till this day, it makes it difficult in this day to travel from one city to another when you really think about just how far it is. It shouldn't be as far, it shouldn't take as long with the distance that it is. And in the past, it really made it difficult for a centralized state to, you know, have wield authority really in these more periphery areas. So the maps that you put together look amazing, and I think it kind of tells a story that's over the last 10 years, over three elections. where this core periphery divide really makes itself known.
Yes, so these are maps at the municipal level of 2026, 2022, both of the second round, and 2016, which was the plebiscite on the peace agreement with the FARC that was narrowly rejected by a very narrow margin, closer, in fact, than this year's election. Um, so at the departmental level, there's really not much change since 2016 in terms of which department is voting for what, and even down at the municipal level, the general patterns are still quite there, even looking back 2016, or even if you look back at 2014. This is a map at the municipal level with municipal boundaries. It doesn't show the population of each city, and of course, like in many countries, land does not vote.
Hmm.
Um, the map might give the impression that Cepeda, which is in pink or purple there on the
Right, right.
2026 map, would have won, but he did not. And 2022, Petro did win, but you like land does not vote. So the major cities have weight. Um, you can see generally, to go quickly, very strong margins for the left all along the Pacific coastline. On every municipality hugging the Pacific coastline, um, Cepeda and Petro 4 years ago won by huge margins with over 90 or 95% of the vote in many of
Hmm.
those municipalities. These municipalities have large Afro-Colombian or indigenous populations in departments like Choco, which has an Afro-Colombian and indigenous majority, which was over 75% or 80% for Cepeda in the runoff,
Right.
as well as in municipalities like Buenaventura in Valle del Cauca and Tumaco in Nariño, which large Afro-Colombian populations, but also inland in the Andean regions of departments like Nariño in the southwest and Cauca and
Yes.
parts of Valle del Cauca. You see very strong margins for the left. This is in part because of indigenous movements that have a long history of political activism, especially in Cauca,
Right.
where the left has always done well there. And
Hmm.
Nariño has become a left-wing stronghold. Cepeda did lose a bit of ground in Nariño and Cauca compared to Petro 4 years ago. Uh, wasn't fatal to him in terms of losing, perhaps, but kind of interesting to see. But in general, these are the core strongholds, and these include cities like Cali in Valle del Cauca, the country's second or third, the country's third largest city, where um, Cepeda, I think, won around 55% of the vote.
In Cali.
And in Cali, yes,
Hmm.
and other major cities like Popayán, Pasto, and Ipiales in Cauca and Nariño as well. Then you see a big conservative stronghold, I guess we could see in Antioquia,
Right.
which is where you find cities like Medellin. So in the kind of Andean west of the country, Antioquia has been the stronghold of Uribismo. That's where Alvaro Uribe is from. That's his political base.
Right.
Um, the Uribista vote went over to Abelardo in the first round, and Antioquia remained a conservative stronghold. It's been a focal point of disputes between the left and right over the past 4 years, with the right as in Antioquia kind of holding themselves up as resistance against Petro and saying from Antioquia we will save Colombia. If Antioquia resists, we can save
Right.
uh, Colombia, and a strong regionalist discourse that's always existed in Antioquia. And Abelardo really did well in Antioquia. I think he won by about 1 million votes in Antioquia, and the coffee access departments of Caldas, Quindio, and Risaralda as well, that are culturally close to Antioquia.
And
Uh,
that's
the Sorry.
and sorry to interrupt. And that's really I look at it as a question of course, Antioquia got this regional uh difference from Bogota really because they were in a way they're disconnected from the central government. They kind of managed to do things themselves. Socioeconomically, it's a much more successful part of the country. So in a way, there's a certain sort of independence that they hold themselves in high regard. Um, and there's a lot of history of landowners in this region, like farmers, maybe small to medium-sized farms, of course, big-sized farms as well, but a lot of plantations over time that gave this region a certain sense of, and I include here the coffee axis as well, el eje cafetero, um, which have a similar cultural connection with Antioquia. This whole region is quite, first of all, it's significantly more white and mestizo than the regions that you mentioned already that have a higher degree of native population and Afro-Colombian population. Um, but also it's higher up on the socioeconomic scale.
Yes, yes, and there's long been a strong regional identity, a Paisa regional identity and regional pride that's really been expressed under the past 4 years as a kind of to differentiate from Petro and the left. There's like movements for federalism are strongest in Antioquia.
Hmm.
Um, and Antioquia has really remained an important right-wing stronghold against in this election. The left is not entirely absent from Antioquia, but in the kind of Andean core of Antioquia, including Medellin, where a lot of the votes are, it's remained very strongly right-wing, with over 60% of the vote for Abelardo. Besides Antioquia, we can look at what I can kind of call an emerging right-wing stronghold formed by departments like Santander, Norte de Santander, Boyacá, and Cundinamarca in the eastern Andean region,
Hmm.
where Abelardo pulled out a vote margin of over 1 million votes, much like in Antioquia.
Right.
Um, so these are departments that have become very strongly right-wing over the past, say, 10 years, especially Norte de Santander, which is for 3 elections in a row the most right-wing department, with 77% of the vote, I think, this year for Abelardo. This is a department on the Venezuelan border, very strongly impacted by what's happened in Venezuela since 2015. So kind
Hmm.
of the chaos and political crisis in Venezuela um, across the border has led to a very strong right-wing vote in Norte de Santander, including in Cucuta, which is the capital, a city on the border very closely tied with Venezuela and with
Right.
close connections with Venezuela, but also in departments like Santander. Santander did move left this year, but this was because um, 4 years ago, the right candidate, Rodolfo Hernandez, was from Santander and had a very strong favorite son vote there. That kind of dissipated a bit, but the
Hmm.
region remained very strongly right wing. And Abelardo still won with over 60% of the vote in Santander. He also did very well in Boyacá. Cundinamarca is the department that surrounds Bogota and is increasingly a suburban department for
Hmm.
Bogota. So it's a bit closer. The left does quite well in several municipalities that are suburbs of Bogota, especially Soacha, which is a very low income suburb to the south of Bogota with a very large population. I think Cepeda got over 100,000 votes out of Soacha. But these departments have become real right-wing strongholds, along with right-wing strongholds that continue in the eastern plains, so the Llanos Orientales, departments like Meta, Casanare, and Arauca. Uh, Meta, especially, and Casanare, which is also one of the most right-wing departments, most Uribista right-wing departments since 2010 or so.
And that
Arauca did. Yes, no, please, sorry.
No, and that was quite interesting when I was looking back at the last elections of the 1990s, where you had those were the last two elections, the first elections with the Constitution of 1991, and the last elections of this liberal and conservative duopoly that the country had in the 20th century. You could really see that the liberals were in fact the party that was strongest in Los Llanos Orientales, the Eastern Plains, the Arauca, Casanare, these places like that. So, and it was in the 2000s under the presidency of Álvaro Uribe where you really saw a shift to the right that you didn't see in other former liberal strongholds like Bogota or the Pacific or even the Caribbean. What do you think happened that saw this region shift to the right? even before this time period that we're currently looking at in the 2000s.
It, I guess we should point out that the Liberal Party in Colombia can be seen as center left, but is not a perfect correlation with the modern left in Colombia. So it's
Right.
different ideologies. So to a certain extent, similar, but also different electoral bases. So the liberals, yes, have traditionally been strong in the Caribbean, the Pacific, much like the left today. But the liberals also had certain strengths in parts of Antioquia and parts of Santander that
Hmm.
did not carry over to the left. And
You
one of
can
their
say,
strengths,
mhm.
and one of their strengths
Yeah,
you
go
said
ahead.
was the Eastern Plains,
Yes.
which was liberal since going back to the 1950s. A
Mhm.
lot of it is because this area was settled by a lot of settlers fleeing violence in Andean regions of Antioquia in the 1950s, and these were liberal settlers. And there is a history of liberal guerrilla groups in the period known as La Violencia from 1948 to the 1950s. And those departments were very strong liberal strongholds with very weak conservative party base, but they became right wing. Not sure if they ideologically maybe they were right wing even as they were voting liberal, but they started voting for right wing candidates identified as such, starting with Uribe in 2002, 2006. Um, in part because there's those regions also had a long history of violence by the guerrilla and a history of paramilitary violence that exterminated in certain regions left-wing traditions, not entirely,
Right.
but also a strong history of depredations by guerrilla FARC violence in the 1990s and 2000s. And it's also it has a very strong ranching culture, so that kind of culture has traditionally been associated with the right, especially nowadays, especially now when the left in Colombia is also attached to causes like animal rights, for example.
Correct.
And
Right.
those urban causes are less popular with this cattle ranching culture that you find in places like Hasanare.
Absolutely. Well, that shift is fascinating, especially if you connect. It's like the somewhat of a cause and effect. It was a fertile grounds of liberal thoughts from settlers, more liberal settlers that came from other parts of the country, and because of that, it actually became a host to, the Marxist guerrilla group rises of the 1960s and then 70s, and then the add-ons of the paramilitary groups. So, uh, the it was a fascinating switch that we saw. And as you say, now it's become this region as a whole, this larger region has really become like a second bastion of the conservative vote in Colombia.
Yeah, the Eastern Andean region, especially as in terms of votes that there are there, the
Mm,
Eastern Andean region is a very important region for the right, along with Antioquia.
absolutely. Do you have anything else to say on this, or maybe should we look at our last maps that we have?
I'll just comment on the Caribbean quickly, since that's the other key region always in Colombian elections. A lot of elections are won and lost there.
It's the most populous of
It
the
is, yes.
regions.
Yes. It does tend to vote less in presidential elections than in congressional elections. It did have quite high turnout, though, in this year's second round. And on the whole, as we mentioned previously, Cepeda did carry it, but by a lesser margin than Petro 4 years ago. Some of that, a good part of it, is because Abelardo is a candidate with Costeño roots. He was raised in Monteria in Cordoba, and he based his campaign out of Barranquilla, where he did quite well compared to Petro to the right 4 years ago. So this region has shifted right a bit, but the general outline of the patterns are still there. Cepeda still carried every major city in the Caribbean, including Cartagena, Santa Marta, Barranquilla, even Monteria. There are right-wing regions with more rural areas of the Caribbean, but generally the patterns there have remained quite similar, but with smaller margins for the left in this election because of Abelardo's roots there.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps more than other regions, perhaps not so much more, but because of the raw vote that the Caribbean has, you have these party machineries that are very important in putting out the vote. For example, is it in Barranquilla, you have the Char family and they really, especially these party machineries, you really see them in action when it comes to the congressional vote in March. And in this election, they weren't as activated. In fact, you know, they were holding out kind of for both candidates.
Yeah, over the past since 2018, party machines don't are ineffective in national presidential elections. They're not a winning strategy. Paloma had the support of the liberals, conservatives, LAU, those big traditional parties with big machines, especially in the Caribbean. That didn't do her any good. It was the
Mm,
same thing for a candidate like Vargas Tijeras in 2018, who was a candidate of the machines, and he had very little success in the first round. So the machines don't work and are not effective in placing votes.
in
Because
presidential elections.
in presidential elections, of course, because a lot of people either don't vote in presidential elections because they're not brought out by machines, or these votes are not bought because there's lots of vote buying by those machines, or they're not dragged out to the polls by the machines, or if they do vote, they feel independent and then don't vote on the basis of what a machine tells them to do, or they don't vote on the basis of voting for a popular local congressional
Right.
candidate.
Absolutely. Look, well, let's move on to our last uh, visuals that you put together for us. So can you give us a kind of an explanation of what you were trying to explain to us with these here?
Yeah, so these are just some simple maps at the departmental level comparing the vote share between right-wing and left-wing candidates in 2022 and this year. So Abelardo is compared to Rodolfo's vote in 2022, and Cepeda is compared, of course, to Petro in 2022. Blue represents an increase in the vote share, and the red represents a decrease in vote share. So we see um, some things to point out on the right for Abelardo, for the right-wing vote, an increase in Bogota, an increase in Atlántico, which is where is Barranquilla,
Hmm.
an increase in other departments in the Caribbean like Sucre, La Guajira, Magdalena, and Cordoba as well, especially. An increase as well, as I noted, in the southwest. So this is still a left-wing stronghold in Nariño, Cauca, and Valle, but Abelardo did improve in terms of vote share by a few points there. Um,
And this is a heavily indigenous populated area of the country, or not necessarily.
Not necessarily. There are large indigenous and Afro-Colombian populations in Cauca and Nariño, but not entirely so. So there are other factors in play with the left-wing vote there. But
Okay.
it's interesting in Nariño, especially, the vote share for the left did go down. Um, in the first round, there was um, some correlation perhaps between homicide rates and the vote share for the left going down. So perhaps municipalities that remain very strongly left-wing, that have suffered a lot from violence between FARC-dissident groups in the Andean and Cordillera region
Hmm.
of 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 Nariño, punishing the left a tiny bit compared to 4 years ago. I wouldn't over extrapolate too much from this because this might be a very localized pattern, but it's still interesting to point out. And I hope there's some more research done on what happened in Arino and Cauca. Um, it's also interesting that running mates in Colombia don't perhaps are not as important as in the United States because the vice presidency is typically less important of a role in actual practice than in the US. So running mates don't have much of an impact on the vote, and we see that there was no impact for Cepeda's running mate Aida Quilque, who was from Cauca. Petro's running mate 4 years ago, Francia Marquez, was also from Cauca. The left did lose votes in Suarez, Cauca, which is where Francia Marquez was from. Um, but the votes that Aida Quilque, the indigenous running mate for Cepeda, would bring, these votes were already voting for the left 4 years ago. So she didn't bring much to the ticket in terms of new votes.
Well,
And
So it's interesting that you point that out, and I wonder because in the first map that I had put together, you saw in the Amazon regions, you saw a big boost. It wasn't just an increase of well, the net margins out were doubled. Of course, it's small margins compared to the other regions of the country, but they went from 70,000 net that Petro had gotten out to around 140 net from those regions. And while that question of the VP candidate, I would say that in this election, it was in fact probably decisive, especially with how, I mean, in an election this tight, anything is decisive. But the fact that Cepeda selected a candidate that really played to his base, and you had Abelardo de la Espriella picking a candidate that really spoke more to concerned moderate voters, that was probably a decisive selection if you look at it.
I think it did have an impact in the campaigning. It's really hard to say how many votes those running mates actually brought to the ticket. And we also saw with Paloma Oviedo did not in the end bring many votes to the ticket,
Right,
despite his success in the right-wing primaries there. So, um, but I do think uh, the symbolism perhaps of Cepeda's choice versus Abelardo's choice was quite important. Cepeda's choice really spoke to his first round strategy, which did not go well, which was to speak to the left wing base and really kind of lock himself up on the left. And he didn't pick a candidate who had a proven track record of bringing votes, and
right.
also a candidate who didn't bring or didn't do anything to attract more centrist voters. And I think not not the candidate in isolation or the running mate in isolation, but the general campaign, this inability to bring in moderate voters or even the interest of bringing in moderate voters on the left in the first round and really locking themselves up in overly triumphalistic strategy in the first round of maximizing the left-wing vote did not work out at all.
Hmm.
And they needed to play catch up a lot in the second round.
Absolutely. Um, And, looking at the map that you see here, we saw that there were two changes to the departmental map from 2022 to 2026. Bichada, which is this large eastern department here, and 4 years ago, it voted for the right-wing candidate for Hernandez, and this year it voted for Cepeda. Any inclination as to why that switch happened?
I think when you look at the municipal level results in Vichada, you see that a lot of the switch happened. There's only 4 municipalities in Vichada. It's a very sparsely populated department.
Mhm.
A lot of the switch happened in a very large municipality, which I believe is named Cumaribo, something very large, the largest municipality by land area in Colombia.
Okay,
This was already very strongly left wing 4 years ago, remained very strongly left wing, 88% or so for Cepeda, but the actual raw vote really, I think, doubled in that municipality. I don't have the exact numbers on hand, but the left wing vote doubled in that municipality, and that municipality has a large indigenous population spread out over a very large land area.
I see.
So I assume it's an impact of mobilizing predominantly indigenous voters in this municipality that allowed the left to double its vote. And in a department that doesn't have that many votes, I think that was important because the other 3 municipalities, including the capital of the department, Puerto Carreño, did not switch sides. They remained quite strongly right wing.
Now, you said at the beginning of the conversation that you weren't surprised by how close the election result was. Now, I don't live in Colombia. I speak with a lot of family members. A lot of my social circle are Colombians from different backgrounds. And it really did feel like both through these discussions and on online, you felt that there was a certain um, momentum coming out of the first round to Abelardo de la Espriella. There weren't a lot of polls coming out in this time, but the polls that did come out were showing Abelardo de la Espriella with a sizable lead. And compounded with that, you also saw Cepeda, in my opinion, run a disastrous second round campaign. Now, with all of that, and I can go into my reasons as to why I think the Cepeda campaign was disastrous, starting from the election night, the first round election night speech, where he didn't accept the results of the election immediately, and as well as the fact that he took too much. He spent around 15 minutes of that speech talking about the results and how they didn't come in first place and things of that nature. Um, why were you not as surprised, in fact, with this?
I do agree that especially the beginning of Cepeda's second round campaign was disastrous. They wasted probably a week not recognizing the results, and they got into mindless nonsense about the soccer jersey worn by a Bloodo supporters. That was a waste of time. They wasted days on this.
Hmm.
But in terms of why I'm not as surprised by the close one, I think it's more about the numbers itself and the structural votes out there. So less about the actual campaigns and how good or bad it was, and more about the numbers out there. So Cepeda's first round result in isolation was not that bad. It was a higher vote, uh, a higher vote in raw vote totals than Petro 4 years ago,
Hmm.
and basically the same or tiny bit higher than Petro's share of the vote 4 years ago. Um, Perhaps looking at the second round results, there are perhaps additional left wing voters who kind of bought into the triumphalism and didn't bother to vote in the first round. Um, but I think in terms of structurally where the votes were, I think the first round did not indicate that it would be a blowout for Abelardo, and I think structurally the left and the right remained quite not evenly matched. There was a right wing structural advantage, and that's why Abelardo still won in the runoff.
Mm.
Not evenly matched, but with not a huge margin separating the two of them. And I do think that a lot of the centrist votes, so people who had voted for Fajardo and Claudia Lopez in the first round, I think it's shown that the majority of them did go for Cepeda in the end. Um, he was helped by the fact that they gave up on the Constituent Assembly boogeyman, I'll call it, very quickly into the second round. It might have come off as very desperate and disingenuous by Petro
Right.
to give up, and it was.
And
But it did lift something off of Cepeda's shoulders and did make him more palatable to the centrist voters who might be predominantly urban and quite liberal or more progressive in their ideas and would be scared of a candidate like Abelardo, who's associated as a far-right extremist and seen as much or more of a danger to democracy and democratic institutions than Cepeda because of his comments or his autocratic tendencies. So I do think in the end a lot of those centrist, liberal-minded voters who really didn't like Petro for the past 4 years
right.
held their nose and voted for Cepeda as the least worst option.
So speaking on that, I have a theory with the results that we saw on Sunday that um, these centrist voters that we see in Colombia follow that have for years kind of fallen into the Sergio Fajardo camp, which is a centrist candidate that in 2018 got in third place. He was very close to jumping over Petro to get into the second round. It kind of deflated in 2022 and as well in 2026. I have a theory that a lot of these centrist voters that we talk about or that the media talks about, they're actually center left voters that are pretty progressive when it comes to their social politics, their when it comes to social issues, but also economic issues as well. But they're institutionalists, and they don't really have a natural home in a political movement in a strong political movement at the moment because they see too many institutional um, threats from Petro and Cepeda's Pacto Histórico party, and also the increasingly right-wing parties on the right. So really, they're kind of like this. It's a false friend name calling them moderates and centrists because at the end of the day, there a lot of them are just naturally more inclined to a more moderate center-left party.
I do agree to a certain extent, um, especially when you look at some centrist politicians. They're more moderate for sure than the left, both on economic issues. They're very, as you said, liberal and institutionalist, so very strong believers in the 1991 Constitution of Colombia and really in the defense of institutions, which is something that both the left and the right are not really strict institutionalist as the centrist might be. And
Mm,
I definitely think in terms of there are moral social issues on issues like LGBT rights, on women's rights, they tend to be more progressive minded, especially when you look at some of the politicians like Jennifer Pedraza, who's the only senator from Fajardo party, Dignidad y Compromiso. She's a former left-leaning student leader. She's been in Congress for the past 4 years as a representative from Bogota. Her politics, in terms of ideology, is quite clearly on the
right.
left,
Yes.
progressive left. She's been very critical of Petro. She's been quasi-opposition to Petro from the left.
Right.
And she did vote for Cepeda, and she did explain it on the basis of Abelardo is a threat or is a risk for the causes that are important to me, like women's rights or gay rights
Right.
or education, public education. So that's just one example we can look at of the kind of voters who voted for Fajardo in the first round, like she did, who went over to Cepeda as the least worst option in the second round on the basis of liberal, progressive, societal, and moral issues,
Hmm.
and some agreeing to disagree on some economic points, and relieved that Cepeda was um, had dropped the Constituent Assembly and had embraced the 1991 Constitution, even though it might have come off as desperate.
Now, and we could certainly continue talking about, Cepeda's movements in the last 3 weeks and what I kind of viewed as just like a really slow and inefficient shift to the center that should have started immediately on election night itself. Um, but I think we can both agree, I guess, from what you're saying, due to the structural kind of like how both sides, the left and the right, are kind of structurally equal, with perhaps a slight advantage to the right in Colombia, which has historically been the case. That really this could have been an election Cepeda had won, right? When you look at the story of Latin America over the past couple of years, with this wave of new right Latin American leaders, it seems like Abelardo de la Espriella, while he kind of fits the mold of one, Colombia doesn't really fit that mold. Maybe it's because Colombia already has a history of rightward leadership more so than some of these other countries. Um, you know, what do you kind of think on that?
I do think he fits the mold of this new right, and in what he's been able to do is also similar to what these new right leaders have done in places like Chile, of replacing the traditional mainstream right, which in Colombia is Uribismo. So in the first round, obviously, he beat Paloma Valencia, the official candidate of Uribismo, by obviously a very big margin of 43
Mm,
to 7% or so.
right,
Which is like the first big shift is that Uribismo or the Uribista party is no longer a big um, a big bloc anymore in presidential elections. So he's replaced the traditional mainstream right with his new movement. He represents a new right with new right-wing leaders to a certain extent, not entirely,
Hmm.
kind of similar to what Cast has done in Chile. He comes from a more far-right, extreme-right party that was traditionally smaller compared to the traditional right-wing parties in Chile, and similar to Milei in Argentina, and I think some other case as well. But this wasn't a blowout election like it was forecast in Chile or Milei in Argentina even. To a certain extent, I think that it reflects that Petro is polarizing, but retained a strong popularity of around 40-45%. That translated into support for Cepeda. We can we can talk more about Petro's ability to remain popular at 45%, despite what a lot of about what's said about him as like his behavior, let's say, especially right now. So his ability to retain that popularity, um, as well as as you said, there is already a history of right-wing politics, including perhaps radical right politics in Colombia that was with Uribismo since 2002. And Uribismo and the right is associated with a lot of voters in Colombia, with left wing voters, with negative things. So there is resistance to right wing politics and a return to the right that there might not be as much as in other countries, but I'm not an expert on those other cases. But so Abelardo does represent a new right, and we are in a transition towards a post-Uribista period on the right. And I think what happens over the next 4 years will be very interesting on that front, over realignments in right-wing politics, right-wing parties, and right-wing dynamics. So he is a new right, but he has inherited a lot of the Uribista vote, and of course the ideology as well.
And, on that point, now Abelardo's coming into office in August, and he starts from a very weak position when it comes to forming, negotiating majorities in the Congress, in both the Senate and the House. In total, in both chambers, he only has five um, representatives and senators in his party. So, you can kind of expect parties like Cambio Radical to be a part of the government. You can expect Centro Democrático. I think they announced today, I think it was, they announced that they were joining the government.
Yes.
I wonder how much negotiation is going to be involved in that because, when it comes to um, their policy, their policy orientation is kind of similar, right? I think it's stylistic, a lot of these differences between what Abelardo represents and the Democratic Centro Democrático. You know, looking at the other, how easy is this governability going to be for Abelardo when you look at just the legislative landscape?
I do think that at least in the first year, it's going to be relatively easy for him in terms of the congressional landscape of governability. So parties on the right, as you mentioned, Cambio Radical and Centro Democrático will quite naturally be part of his governing coalition. And we can expect parties like the Liberals, the Conservatives especially, and much of the Partido de la U to fall behind Ablado in Congress, especially in the first year. He
Hmm.
does already have contacts and connections within all three of those traditional parties that hold a significant number of seats in both houses. Those parties, especially liberals, conservatives, and Lau, they tend to want to be in government regardless of who is president. They're kind of like those parties in Brazil that have been with every administration, left or right.
Right.
Um, they're more opportunistic parties. They've lost whatever ideology they might have had in terms of the liberals and conservatives.
Just as was
The
the case with Petro 4 years ago, you had the
Yes,
conservatives
yes.
running his government as well.
But the other thing traditionally is that in Colombia, that congressional support is acquired by giving bureaucratic patronage appointments to members of those parties, including cabinet, but also in other government agencies.
Mhm.
Petro did that in the first year with the conservatives, the liberals, and so on. Uribe did that a lot. Santos was the master of that in his time.
Mhm.
Um, Abelardo, from his campaign, rejected los políticos de siempre, so these classic forever career politicians. He's presented himself as los nadies, so we've never lived off the state, we've never been corrupt. Um, in the second round, he still maintained that line and rejected the endorsement or potential endorsement of the Liberal Party. Didn't do anything to reach out or embrace the conservatives. Lau, he didn't even embrace or reach out to Uribismo. And there is still conflict or bad blood from the campaign between Uribe and I think Abelardo's campaign strategist that is still playing out
Right.
uh, right now. So will Abelardo maintain that rejection towards los políticos de siempre in his cabinet and how and the people he will work with? Um, if so, that could make his governability a bit more difficult. Parties like the Liberals, the Conservatives, Lau, and even Centro Democrático will have less of an incentive to be as nice and play along as nicely if they
Right.
don't have the patronage and that kind of bureaucratic quotas they see in Colombia in his government. He hasn't formed his cabinet yet. He does want to cut the state by 40%, which would impact patronage appointments to a certain
Although I
extent,
think you'll have to start cutting that, retracting a little bit from that because of the lack of mandate, really.
clearly. Um, but it will be interesting to see who he puts in his cabinet. There's been some speculation already online, and a lot of the names that have been circulated strike me as a mix of traditional conservative technocrats, but also a lot of what he would call políticos de siempre, including people who've been in his campaign. Uh, as one example, there is former Liberal Center Mauricio Gomez, who was one of the first centers to endorse him last year, a Liberal center from the Caribbean coast, traditionally close to the party's leader, Cesar Gaviria.
Right.
Mauricio Gomez is going to be in government. Abelardo has said so. There's been even speculation of conservative Senator Efraín Cepeda, who will no longer be in the Senate from this next term as a potential name for cabinet. There's been names of people close to the Charista clan of Barranquilla, like Elsa Noguera, who's a former governor of Atlántico, close to Alex Char, who might also be in cabinet. So perhaps he will moderate or change his tone on governing with Los Políticos de Siempre and will include more of those traditional politicians to bring
Right.
in support, especially in Congress. People like Mauricio Gomez could be key for the Liberal Party. Another name that's been circulated is for the presidency of the Senate in the first year. The name that seems to be going around is Alfredo Heluque, who's a Partido Lau Center from La Guajira, who endorsed Abelardo in this campaign, but is very much a politico de siempre. He comes from a long political dynasty in that department with a lot of votes in La Guajira. So he would be kind of
Right.
the leader of the coalition in the first year, at least, in the Senate. And the presidency of the Senate will be one of the first big fights we'll see on July 20th with the new Congress,
Absolutely.
and see how successful Abelardo is at putting together a coalition. In the first year, Petro was very successful in Congress, but the first year is always the easiest part for a Colombian president. From the second year, it starts to get much more complicated, and going to the third and fourth year, it's another story.
Well, Gael, I think we covered a lot of ground. It was a great opportunity to speak, to share our thoughts on this election and gain some insights from you. Appreciate your time.
Of course, it was great talking to you.